Some people make mistakes they can fix over a long weekend. Britt Hadley made the kind that require considerably more creative solutions. Most accountants develop an instinct for knowing when to stop looking. After 7 years of staring at other people's numbers, Britt understood that the entries buried deepest were the ones most likely to get someone killed. She understood this the way she understood that Vancouver in February was brutal, and that her landlord would not accept, "I found a discrepancy as rent," intellectually, without the common sense to actually apply it. She found the entry at 11:53 on a Wednesday night, alone in the Haddon and Cross boardroom with a cold Tim Hortons and 400 pages of Fallon Logistics quarterly reports. 3 lines, 3 separate journal entries in a subsidiary ledger for port handling fees, each routed through a numbered company incorporated in the Cayman Islands, dated 4 months apart. The amounts were individually unremarkable. Together they reconciled to exactly 0, a clean surgical 0 that no legitimate business transaction ever produced naturally. Natural transactions left mess, rounding errors, fractions. This was intentional. Someone very good at numbers had written it, and someone slightly better had buried it, in the place a junior auditor wasn't supposed to look. Britt looked. She photographed the page with her phone. She cross-referenced it against the Port Authority filings she'd requested 2 weeks ago and half expected never to receive. Then she sat back in her chair and ate the last of a granola bar she'd found in her coat pocket from some earlier, more optimistic version of her life. The next morning she showed it to Pippa. Pippa Rowe was Britt's closest friend at the firm, primarily because Pippa was the only person at Haddon and Cross who didn't treat Britt like a charity hire. Pippa had been with the firm 6 years longer, had twice the wardrobe budget, and possessed a social survival instinct that Britt fundamentally lacked. Pippa looked at the ledger page for approximately 4 seconds. "Put that away," she said, "right now. It's a ghost entry, Pip. 3 of them. Whoever structured this is good, but the offset pattern is." Britt. Pippa's voice dropped to the register she used when she was genuinely alarmed and trying not to show it. "Do you know who Fallon Logistics belongs to?" Britt frowned. "The audit file says the principal shareholder is Fallon." The name landed flat, the way names did when you were supposed to recognize them, and didn't. Britt looked at Pippa's face and recalibrated. "Should I know who that is?" "He owns the Port of Vancouver terminal operations, half the cold storage facilities north of the inlet, 3 registered companies and somewhere between 7 and 12 unregistered ones, depending on which CRA agent you ask." Pippa paused. "Nobody asks him questions, Britt. Nobody. Our senior partners bid for this contract for 4 years. 4 years. They got it because Fallon decided to give it to them, and the understanding, the very clear understanding, is that we do a clean audit, find nothing unusual, invoice at the agreed rate, and we do not call anyone." Britt looked at the ledger page again. "But there is something unusual." "I know. 3 ghost entries, that." "I know. Someone will find them eventually. If we file a clean audit and someone finds them later, the firm gets." "I know." Pippa pressed her fingertips to her temples. "So we pull the subsidiary thread out of scope. We cite insufficient documentation on the numbered company, and we move on." Britt stared at her. "That's not what forensic accounting is for." "Britt." Pippa looked at her with something that was half exasperation, half genuine concern. "I like you. So I am telling you this as someone who genuinely likes you. Do not bring this to the client meeting tomorrow." The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock Thursday. Fallon Logistics' Vice President of Finance would be present, along with 2 senior partners from Haddon and Cross and Britt, because she was the one who'd spent 6 weeks buried in the files. Pippa dropped a $20 bill on Britt's desk that morning. "I bet you $20 you don't bring it up." "That's not a bet, that's a bribe." "It's both, take it." The meeting ran 90 minutes. The vice president was smooth and expensive and entirely uninterested in the junior auditor at the far end of the table. The senior partners steered the conversation efficiently, surfacing only the items pre-approved for discussion. Britt sat quietly through 60 minutes of it. Then the conference room door opened and the temperature dropped. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The vice president went slightly rigid. One of the senior partners straightened her jacket. The other reached for his water glass and missed it. Fallon walked in the way a man walked into a room he owned, which, in this case, was literally true, since Haddon and Cross leased their offices from a property management company that shared a registered address with a Fallon Logistics subsidiary. Britt had noticed that 2 weeks ago and filed it away as a mildly interesting coincidence. It did not feel like a coincidence now. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than the cut of his jacket suggested. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and healed slightly wrong, old scars on the backs of his hands, the kind you didn't get from paperwork. His face held no particular expression. He sat down at the head of the table without being invited and looked at the summary sheet in front of him. The meeting continued. Britt watched him. He read the document the way she read ledgers, not line by line, but in a single sustained scan that caught everything worth catching. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both already answered in the documentation. She understood he was testing whether the partners had actually read it. They had, barely. At the 83rd minute, one of the partners said, "We're satisfied with the scope of review as outlined. Unless there are additional items. There are 3 entries in the Q3 subsidiary ledger that don't reconcile," Britt said. The room went the kind of quiet that preceded very bad outcomes. She could feel Pippa's $20 burning through her coat pocket, and the certain knowledge she was about to lose it. Fallon turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time he'd actually looked at anyone in the room as though they existed. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and entirely level. "Port handling fees, Q2 through Q3, Britt continued. She pulled the page from her folder and set it on the table in front of her, not offering it, just placing it there. 3 entries through a Cayman-registered numbered company. They net to 0 on consolidation, which isn't how these fees are typically structured. The amounts are small enough individually to fall below automated review thresholds, but together they suggest a deliberate offset. I can't file a clean report without flagging them." The vice president opened his mouth. Fallon raised 1 finger. 1. The vice president closed his mouth. Fallon looked at Britt for a long moment. "The numbered company is a legacy structure from a 2019 acquisition," he said. "The entries were a transitional reconciliation item. We have documentation." A pause. "We'll send it over by end of week." "That would be helpful," Britt said. "Thank you." The meeting ended 12 minutes later. The senior partners did not look at her on the way out. Pippa appeared at Britt's elbow in the hallway and held out another 20. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Either way. The documentation didn't arrive by end of week. It didn't arrive the week after either. On Monday morning, Britt found a man standing beside her car in the parking structure. He was large in the specific way that suggested his job description involved being large. He wore a dark jacket and a neutrals expression and said, "Mr. Fallon would like a word." Britt looked at him, then at her car. Then she said, "I have a 9 o'clock. Mr. Fallon is aware." She thought about this for approximately 10 seconds, then got in, because the alternative was standing in a parking garage arguing with someone twice her size, and she was too tired for that. Fallon was already in the back seat. He looked like he'd been awake since the meeting, possibly before it. There were shadows under his eyes, and his jaw held the particular set of a man who ran on controlled tension rather than sleep. He was reading something on his phone and didn't put it down when she got in. The door shut. The car didn't move. "The documentation doesn't exist," Britt said, because she'd had several days to think about it, and there was no version of this conversation improved by pretending otherwise. Fallon put his phone down. "No. The entries are a deliberate structure, probably legitimate in intent, but irregular enough that I can't sign off without documentation that corroborates the offset. I'm aware of what you can and can't sign off on. Then why am I here?" He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her across the boardroom, that level cataloging assessment, like she was an entry in a ledger he was deciding how to classify. "The firm that retained Haddon & Cross isn't a genuine client," he said. "It's a competitor. They've been trying to find a regulatory crack in my port operations for 3 years. They hired your firm because they needed an auditor who didn't know what they were looking at. Someone junior, someone thorough." A pause. "You found exactly what they sent you to find." "I wasn't sent to find anything. I found it because it was there." "I know." He said it without inflection, but something in it shifted. "That's the problem. An auditor following instructions would have looked past it. One who was in on it would have forwarded the photographs to her handlers by now. You brought it up in the meeting in front of witnesses because you thought it was a legitimate audit finding." Another pause. "Which means you're neither. I'm a forensic accountant who found an irregular ledger entry." "That's not all you are anymore." His voice carried no apology. "The people who arranged this contract know you found those entries. If you file a clean report, they'll assume you've been bought and come to you directly. If you flag them, they have the regulatory ammunition they need to challenge our port licensing. Either way, you've become part of a problem you didn't create." Outside the tinted window, Britt could see the ordinary grey concrete of the parking structure, the ordinary fluorescent light, the ordinary Monday going on without her. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know the full scope of what they know." He held her gaze. "You've spent 6 weeks in our files. I need to know which data areas they specifically directed you toward before you started. Which files they flagged. That tells me how much they already have. That's confidential client strategy. Your client is trying to destroy a company that employs 400 people in this city." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to look at what was asked of you and tell me whether it resembles a genuine audit or a targeted excavation." Britt was quiet for a moment. A car alarm went off 2 levels up and echoed through the concrete. "I want to see the actual documentation for those 3 entries," she said, "whatever it is, even if it's irregular." "Why?" "Because if I'm going to have an opinion about whose side I'm on, I'd like it based on actual numbers." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "Get your things from your desk. You're not going back to that office." The building he took her to was in Yaletown, a converted warehouse with no visible signage, a freight elevator, and a floor-to-ceiling view of False Creek through windows that had been installed in the last 5 years and cost more than Britt made in 2. The 4th floor was offices, clean, spare, occupied by people who moved with the efficiency of employees who understood the cost of wasted time. Fallon's own office was a long room with 2 desks, his at one end. A secondary one, cleared and set up with a fresh monitor and a legal pad at the other. "The files you need are on the server," he said. "Huxley will set you up with access." Huxley turned out to be the man from the parking garage, who was apparently also capable of configuring network permissions with unsettling speed. "I need my coffee," Britt said. Fallon looked at her. "There's a machine in the hall." "It's not the same as—" "I'll send someone." They came back with a large, dark roast from the place 3 blocks over that Britt had never been able to afford more than once a week. She didn't comment on this. She sat down at the secondary desk and started reading. She stayed until 7 that evening. The documentation for the 3 entries was, as she'd suspected, not clean. But it also wasn't what the competing firm had implied. The Cayman structure was a legacy holding from a 2017 acquisition, a fast, quiet purchase made before the target company's creditors could mount a challenge. Not illegal, aggressive, the kind of thing that looked from the outside like exactly what his competitors had suggested, and looked from the inside like a company that moved fast and cleaned up paperwork later. "It's not fraud," Britt said when Fallon returned at 6:30. She'd expected him earlier and then hadn't. and had spent the last half-hour quietly furious at herself for noticing. No, he agreed. He set a paper bag on the edge of her desk without comment and took his jacket off, draping it over the back of his own chair. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, more scars there than on his hands. She looked at the paper bag instead. "It's defensible," she said. "You'd need good tax counsel and probably a 6-week delay on any regulatory challenge, but it's defensible." "I know. Your competitors don't know it's defensible. They know it looks bad. That's all they've been building toward, not an actual finding. Just enough to force a regulatory review that delays your port license renewal by 12 to 18 months. In this market, that's enough to cost you significant contracts." Fallon looked at her. "You've thought about this a great deal for someone who isn't being paid to." "I'm being held in your office against my will," Britt said. "I had time." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Almost something. "The food is from the place on Mainland Street," he said. "You've been here 9 hours." She had been. She hadn't quite registered it until he said so. She pulled the bag toward her and found a bowl of congee and a container of pork buns, and for a moment she didn't trust herself to say anything, because she was very tired and the food was warm and she hadn't eaten since that morning. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He sat down at his own desk and didn't make anything of it. They worked in silence for an hour, not an uncomfortable silence. Britt had worked in a lot of silences. Cheap apartments with thin walls, late-night boardrooms with humming ventilation, and this one had a particular quality. Dense. Occupied. Like the room was full of something neither of them was saying. On the third day, she found what she hadn't been looking for. She'd been reviewing the pre-audit briefing documents Haddon and Cross had provided at the start of the engagement, the ones outlining which data areas she was supposed to review. She'd read them as professional guidance. Now, with 3 days of Fallon's files in her head, they looked different. The briefing had been very specific about which subsidiaries to prioritize. It had steered her away from 2 data areas and pointed her directly at the port handling fee ledgers. It had flagged the Q2-Q3 period as a high-risk zone without specifying why. She hadn't questioned it at the time. Junior auditors followed briefing documents. She pulled up the retained client list and traced the fee arrangement back to the entity that had commissioned the audit. Then she went 1 layer further. The company that had hired Haddon and Cross had, 18 months ago, moved significant capital through a nominee director structure to purchase 3 commercial properties in East Vancouver. The nominee structure was registered in Alberta. The registered agent was a numbered company whose registered address was shared with a law firm. 2 of the firm's principals appeared in a Securities Commission enforcement notice Britt had processed in a previous role. It wasn't airtight. It was the kind of thing that required careful months of documentation to make actionable. But it was there, sitting in the numbers the way things always sat in numbers when someone thought they'd hidden them well enough. She sat with it for 20 minutes. Then she printed it and walked down the hall. Fallon was on the phone. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face shifted. Not alarm, but the specific alertness of a man who had learned to read approaching information before it arrived. He ended the call. Britt set the printout on his desk. "I wasn't looking for this." He read it without rushing. He turned to the second page, read that, set it down. "Where did you find it?" She told him. She explained the nominee structure and the property purchase and the registered agent and what she'd recognized in the principals. She was precise. She didn't speculate past the documentation. When she finished, Fallon looked at her for a moment. "You could have left this alone," he said. It was in the numbers. She crossed her arms over her chest. The fluorescent light overhead had a faint flicker she'd been ignoring for 3 days. "I don't leave things alone when they're in the numbers. It's a character flaw." "It's not a flaw." His voice was low and direct in a way she'd stopped bracing for somewhere around the second day. It's the first genuinely useful thing anyone has brought me in 3 months that I didn't already know. Britt looked at him. She was aware, in a way she'd been carefully not being aware of for 3 days, of how quiet the building had gotten and the particular quality of his attention when it was directed entirely at her. He looked at her the way he looked at numbers, like she was something he was deciding how to understand rather than what to do with. She wasn't sure which she preferred. "What happens now?" she asked. "I make some calls. The challenge to my license renewal becomes significantly more complicated for the people bringing it." He paused. "It'll be resolved by end of week." She should have felt relieved. She almost did. "And then what?" she said. "I go back, file the audit." "The engagement with Haddon and Cross is terminated. The senior partners have already been informed." He said it the way he said most things, as a fact that had already occurred and did not require her emotional participation. "You'll receive severance commensurate with your notice period. No professional repercussion on your record. You walk away clean." He was giving her an out, a full clean exit. He was handing her ordinary life back with both hands. Britt looked at the printout on his desk, then at him. "I want to see the rest of your books," she said. Fallon went completely still. Not the way he'd gone still in the boardroom, when she'd raised the ledger entries and the room had clenched. This was different. This was the stillness of a man recalculating something he'd already considered settled. Britt. Her name in his mouth was different from how anyone else said it, heavier, like he'd decided to be precise about it. "If you walk further into this, I won't be able to walk you back out." "I know. Everyone in my world is either a liability or an asset. I don't do neutrals. I don't do consultants who work a quarter and disappear. If you stay, you stay." His eyes held hers without flinching. "That's the only arrangement I know how to offer." "I understand ledgers," she said. "That one I understand." He studied her face. Looking, she suspected, for the practical exhaustion she'd carried for 7 years asserting itself as common sense. He was right to look. She'd turned this over every direction for 3 days, lying awake in the guest suite, 2 floors down that she'd told herself she was only using because it was late. SkyTrain stopped running. She knew exactly what she was saying. "The numbered company structure needs to be unwound before the next filing period," she said. "The Alberta nominee situation is going to require documentation that can't be pulled together in a week. And your Q4 provisions are understated by somewhere between 8 and 11%, depending on which port fee schedule applies after the January amendments." Fallon looked at her for another long moment. Then he pulled a second chair to his side of the desk and said, "Sit down." She did. Outside the city ran its ordinary machinery, container ships on the inlet, the SkyTrain above the street, the grey February sky pressing down on everything equally indifferent to what happened inside any particular building. Inside, Fallon opened a file on his screen, turned the monitor so she could see it, and said, "Start here." Some mistakes cost you a career. Some cost you the clean life you'd been building out of careful habits and overdue bill payments, and not asking questions in rooms where asking questions got people hurt. Britt had known since Wednesday night, in the Haddon and Cross boardroom, with her cold coffee and her 400 pages, exactly what kind of mistake she was making. The strange thing, the thing she hadn't accounted for, was that it was the first decision she'd made in years that didn't feel like survival. It felt like something that had finally, deliberately, started.